Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 144, A Series of Serious Conversations. Hitoshi was thankful that Aizawa was thoughtful enough to inform him that his classmates were relatively unscathed before the night was through. His mom had been sitting there biting her nails next to him while they both intently watched the news. The next morning, the press released a statement saying that Endeavor had caught the hero killer, and if Hitoshi hadn't already been informed that Midoriya was okay, he may have just spontaneously combusted from stress. You would think that borderline hating someone would make you worry less about them, but that was clearly not the case. Monday. He would talk to Midoriya on Monday. He had no clue what he was going to say to him, but he was going to do it. He was sick and tired of being angry. He was under no disillusions that he would come out of that conversation not angry, but he hoped to at least be less angry. Izuku was getting tired of the feeling that accompanied going back to school post-catastrophe. First, the USJ, then his family issues, and now this. They hadn't even been in school that long. How has this already happened 3 times? He supposed this level of incident frequency wasn't new to him, but having other people know about said incidents was. The process of reassimilating was much easier when no one cared. He, Ida, and Todoroki were usually among the first to arrive at class, so hopefully it wouldn't be too bad. Thankfully, everyone seemed distracted by telling their own stories for a good long while, but eventually the conversation pivoted the entire class's attention to them. Izuku didn't miss the way that Todoroki tensed up when Hagakure praised Endeavor for, quote, saving them. He didn't want the glory for taking Stain in, but he definitely didn't want Endeavor to have it. Todoroki's expression agreed with him. Izuku was doing his best to ignore the conversation so that he wouldn't end up sticking his foot in his mouth. But, of course, that's exactly what happened. He couldn't keep his horrified reaction in when Kaminari said that the hero killer was actually kind of cool. Kaminari! He snapped before he could think better of it. The whole class went silent, not having expected an outburst like that from him. Kaminari quickly apologized, and Ida took over damage control, which Izuku was grateful for. He shifted the group's attention away from Izuku and onto himself, but he could still sense a pair of eyes on him. The familiar set that had made a habit of boring into the back of his skull. Shinso. Their eyes met for a moment, but neither of them broke the silence, even though it looked like Shinso wanted to. Izuku just turned around and did his best to not think about it. He had enough going on right now. All Might had texted him saying that they needed to talk during lunch, and he also needed to talk to Todoroki about his, sleuthing? 2 talks that he was very much not looking forward to. He needed to explain things to Shinso as well, but he needed to get clearance from Eraser about it first, and after everything that had happened this week, he just wasn't ready. He knew that that wasn't fair to Shinso, but he did his best to ignore that as well. He could only handle one catastrophe at a time. Hitoshi had caught Midoriya's eye several times throughout the day. It was like he already knew that he wanted to talk. He did his best to convince himself that that would make it easier. But he's not so sure that it did. He had planned to talk to him at lunch, but when the bell rang and he was about to pull him aside, he turned tail and ran in the opposite direction of the cafeteria. What the hell was that about? He kept looking over to Midoriya's usual table all period, but he never showed up. All right, Tuesday then. He'd talked to Midoriya on Tuesday. Toshinori was more nervous than he had been about a conversation in a long time. He knew that Midoriya was still recovering from the incident in Hosu, but he couldn't put this off any longer. The Nomu were proof of his worries, and if he was right, which he desperately hoped that he wasn't, then Midoriya was in grave danger. If All for One was still alive, then he had painted a target on his boy's head. He was not sure whether he was worried that Midoriya would be mad at him or wouldn't be mad at him. That kid was far too forgiving, but he had the right to be angry about this, to be angry at him. However, Toshinori had the feeling that he would just push it all under the rug. He was pulled from his thoughts by a quiet knock at the door, so he called for Midoriya to enter. "Hi, All Might," he greeted with his trademark nervous stutter. Toshinori had noticed him speak without a stutter a few times, so he knew it was just a nervous tic. He spoke much more clearly when he wasn't so anxious, like in the hospital, when he was as high as a kite on pain meds, or when he was talking to his friends. He wished he wasn't so nervous around Toshinori, but as All Might, he was used to it. "Hello, my boy. You look like you're doing well. I heard you ended up in the hospital." He broached the topic with all the grace of a bull in a china shop. "Oh, yeah, but I'm fine. What did, you wanted to talk to me?" He had hoped to catch up with him more, but this conversation really shouldn't be put off. "Yes, it's very important, actually. I'm afraid I haven't been fully honest with you about One for All." He started after Midoriya had taken his seat. His expression was unreadable, and he didn't say anything, so Toshinori continued. "Not about the power itself, but where it came from," he reassured. "As you know, you are the ninth wielder. The power is old, and its origin is even older. The story goes back over 100 years ago to the dawn of quirks, the Dark Age, which I'm sure you've learned about. As you know, the world was in upheaval, but there was a man who was erased from history books. It's the type of shameful history that people don't like to think about. He had the power to take quirks. He could either give them away or keep them for himself. He became very powerful and manipulated people into following him while he ruled over the chaos as a tyrant. His name, by this point, is lost to time, but his quirk was called All for One." Toshinori paused to see Midoriya's brows raise in recognition, but he still didn't know how to read that. He waited for a question or a response, but he got nothing, so he continued. "Hardly anyone stood up to him, and those who didn't stand a chance. The only one who lived through opposing him was his brother, presumably because whatever last bit of humanity he had left stopped him from killing his own flesh and blood. In an attempt to win over his brother's favor, All for One forced a quirk onto him. They had both been under the impression that he was quirkless. But when the stockpiling quirk All for One gave him, combined with his own latent and useless ability to pass on quirks, One for All was born. The quirk passed from wielder to wielder until it was strong enough to take down All for One. My injury. Toshinori stopped himself from grasping at his side, but he could tell Midoriya had already noticed the aborted motion. Was from that fight. Midoriya was listening to him with the same inscrutable blank expression, and there was no more hedging around the issue that he could do. There was a side effect to All for One's quirk, however. It didn't work on some people, or it did, but the process left them essentially brain dead. They became like mindless living dolls, incapable of speaking. Just like the Nomus. He trailed off. Finally, Midoriya's expression shifted to something tangible. Surprise. Even if it was just for the briefest moment, his expression quickly fell back to the strange, just left of neutral face that it had been since he sat down, and silence hung heavy in the air until Midoriya eventually found the words to break it. So, all for one is still. Midoriya trailed off and left his question unasked. We think so, yes. I had suspected it after the first Nomu, but now it seems foolish to keep denying it. He answered what he knew Midoriya was getting at. He was waiting for anger or fear, but still there was nothing. He just sat there and took in the information like Toshinori was reporting on the weather. Did he understand the gravity of the situation? Was he in shock? His life had been one catastrophe after the other. Had he just grown used to it? I never meant to put all this on you, my boy, but you need to know the danger you're in. No one can know that you hold One for All. Right now, the League's focus is still on me, and we need to keep it that way. The less they know, the better, Toshinori stressed. If nothing else, he needed to make sure Midoriya knew how to keep himself safe. His hands were curled into fists, bunching up the material of his pants by his knees. The white-knuckled grip made the pale scars adorning his right hand fade to nearly invisible. Whether the action was out of fear or anger or both, Toshinori couldn't say. He was far too aware of how the boy held things close to his chest. He knew how skilled he was at hiding how he felt. And, not for the first time, Toshinori was cursing that talent. All right, he finally spoke up, his tone calmer than ever. It wasn't all right. They both knew it wasn't all right. But it also seemed as though they both knew there was nothing for it. Nothing could be done. They both had a shit lot in life, and it tore at his heart to know how his boy was used to that feeling. Are you all right? Toshinori finally asked. With everything that happened in Hosu and this, he clarified, hoping that it wasn't obvious how little experience he had with talks of this nature. The corners of Midoriya's mouth twitched up into somewhere between a smile and a grimace. I'm fine. He forced out the predicted response. Toshinori might not be the best at this, but he wasn't stupid. He knew Midoriya was far from fine. Given everything that has happened to him in such a short span of time, hell, even in a long span of time, it would be insane for him to be all right. He's not sure why he had even bothered asking. It's not like he could help. He was having trouble sleeping himself, and he hadn't even been there. Though he supposed that was why he was having trouble sleeping. He had slept through the whole disaster. Midoriya was fighting for his life, and Toshinori was just snoozing away. He fought back a sigh. This was such a mess, and he had no clue how to even begin to salvage it. I am here. To talk, I mean, he clarified with an awkward laugh. He hadn't meant to offer out a catchphrase. It certainly wasn't the time for jokes, but it made Midoriya laugh, so he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Thanks, All Might, he said with a sad smile. He should be scared. He knew he should be scared, and he was, but not for the reasons he ought to be. Finding out that you've inherited an all-powerful arch-nemesis that could go toe-to-toe with All Might should probably have you sticking your head in the sand. But it didn't. He just felt tired. He had had a target on his head for years, and it seemed as though it just kept getting bigger. He was better off alone, where no one could get caught in the crossfire, but he was selfish. Cutting Shinso off hadn't entirely been because of the gang's looming threat, but it had certainly been a part of it. It had been one of the hardest things he had ever done, and he couldn't bear to do it again. Honestly, he didn't think it was feasible to do something like that again. Eraser was a stubborn bastard who would hunt him down to the ends of the earth, and dropping out of school now would have the police on his tail anyway. He couldn't face this alone, and that, more than anything else, is what scared him. Tuesday rolled around, and again, Hitoshi steeled his nerves. He was going to talk to Midoriya today. He was actually in the cafeteria. There was no getting out of it. He would wait until they both got their lunches, then ask him to talk. Easy. Midoriya was a few people ahead of him in line, which meant he would be sitting with his friends by the time Hitoshi got the chance to ask. So he was going to have to do that in front of them, which was less than ideal, but that was fine. He could do it. He had certainly faced down worse. After getting his tray, he turned around and started making his way toward Midoriya's usual table, only to find that he wasn't there. Again. He was just in front of him. He couldn't have gone far. He looked around the room for the familiar shock of green hair and spotted him, walking out the door with Todoroki. He was avoiding him. He knew he was looking at him differently ever since he got back. He knew that Midoriya knew he wanted to talk. And now he was avoiding him, wasn't he? He felt his grip on the tray and his hands grow painful, but he ignored it and sat at an empty table in the corner of the room. An anger that he had grown far too familiar with settled heavily in his gut. If Midoriya wanted to ignore him, well, two could play at that game. Gearing himself up for the second difficult conversation of the week, Izuku pulled Todoroki away from the group and asked if he would have lunch with him outside so that they could talk. He agreed without complaint, and a few minutes after they sat under the shade of a tree and set their trays down on the grass in front of them, Izuku bit the bullet. Todoroki, do you want to get out of Endeavor's house? Like, if you could leave, would you? Todoroki looked away for a moment to think about the question, his brow furrowed as if weighing the pros and cons before he turned his attention back to Izuku. Where else would I go? He asked. I don't know. Say you could just live with your siblings or something and never see your father again. If you could do that, would you? Yes, he replied, this time with no hesitation. All right. Good. That's good. He trailed off awkwardly, unsure how to broach the topic he had brought Todoroki here to discuss. In the end, he decided that Todoroki would prefer he just be as direct as possible. You know the way your dad treats you is illegal, right? He shouldn't be putting his hands on you ever. That's abuse. He could get arrested for that, or at the very least get his hero license and parental rights revoked. If he told the authorities, I mean. Todoroki's expression turned to confusion. But it's just training. He never hurts me outside of training, he argued. He makes you train, though. If you said that you didn't want to, would he let you stop? No, Todoroki admitted after a moment of silence. He's the number 2 hero, though. I doubt much would come of an investigation. He has more than enough money to keep people quiet. That doesn't matter if you have irrefutable proof, he insisted. But I don't, Todoroki shot back. Izuku met his intense gaze and chewed at his lip. There was no more beating around the bush. He had to tell Todoroki what he'd done and what he'd seen. I do, he stated simply. Todoroki responded with a simple raise of his eyebrow, silently prompting him to elaborate. You're allowed to hate me as much as you want after this. I needed to give you the option to get out of there. I have proof of everything. Your statement about your parents' marriage, your siblings' statements about the dynamics at home, and proof of what your father considers training. I have it all recorded. I planned it all before the internships, but I won't turn it in. Not unless that's what you want. He forced the admission out of his mouth. He couldn't look at him while he spoke, but now that he had laid all his cards out, he looked back up to Todoroki, though he was unable to keep the grimace off of his face. What he had done was a complete invasion of privacy and something he was fully prepared to not be forgiven for. But he was used to losing friends at this point. What do you mean? You recorded proof? His voice was as flat and toneless as it ever was. It would probably not have been noticeable to anyone who wasn't paying as close attention to Todoroki as Izuku had been, but he could hear subtle tension. He was not happy, and Izuku couldn't blame him. I, um, I had an audio recorder on me pretty much the whole time, and I planted a bug in the training room the night before you guys, or I don't blame you for that. The night he ditched me at the agency. Cold anger made its home in Todoroki's eyes, and Izuku knew whatever friendship they had been fostering between them was over. You did that on purpose? You sent me after the villain you knew I couldn't take down on my own, just so that you could get proof of my father beating me? Todoroki all but shouted. He'd stood up with clenched fists, and Izuku didn't even register how he shrank in on himself before he spoke. No! I didn't mean for... I didn't even know his quirk. I went after the group of 3 before. I never would have left you with him if I knew. I never wanted you to get hurt. I wasn't thinking. I just... There were civilians. I didn't think about how your father was watching. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. He cut himself off abruptly when he realized he couldn't hear Todoroki anymore. He couldn't see Todoroki anymore, actually, and it took him an embarrassingly long amount of time to realize that was because he had hidden himself behind his own arms. He was huddled up against the tree he'd been leaning on, with his legs tucked to his chest and his arms covering his head. He forced his arms down and his eyes back up. Todoroki was still standing in front of him, with one outstretched hand frozen between them as he stared at Izuku with concern. Shame flared hot in his gut. He was acting pathetic, just so that Todoroki wouldn't be mad at him. This was childish. He needed to get a hold of himself. I'm sorry, he said again as he forced his limbs back into a relaxed posture. Todoroki didn't say anything for a while. He lowered his hand back to his side once Izuku forced his stiff limbs to slacken, but he didn't say anything. He just looked at Izuku like he was a petri dish under a microscope for an uncomfortably long amount of time. You didn't provoke him on purpose? Todoroki finally asked. No, I would never do anything to risk your safety, he replied with as much conviction as he could manage. All right, Todoroki responded simply. All right, what? I believe you. I apologize for accusing you of that, he clarified. Izuku couldn't do much more than stare back at him dumbfounded. Midoriya, are you okay? Todoroki asked after another unprompted staring contest. What? I mean, yeah, I'm fine. Are you safe at home? Todoroki echoed back the question Izuku had asked him so long ago. Izuku laughed. He didn't mean to. It just happened. It was hardly an appropriate response, so he bit his tongue quickly. Sorry. I didn't mean to laugh. Yes, I'm safe at, home, he assured him. I don't believe you. Todoroki replied bluntly. I don't. He trailed off dumbly, not really knowing what to say to that. You flinch constantly, Todoroki pointed out. Yeah, sorry. He apologized, but his confused tone made it sound more like a question. I doubt it's your fault. Well, that was debatable. He had purposefully stuck himself into most of the incidents that had traumatized him, but he wasn't about to explain that. I am fine, or, safe at home. He choked the last word out, even though it felt wrong. I, didn't used to be, but I am now. The explanation seemed to satiate his worry for the time being, though Izuku doubted he was going to drop the issue entirely. After the incredibly strange accusation at the sports festival, Todoroki would stare at him and All Might during heroics as if trying to prove his theory that they were somehow related. He hadn't brought it up again, but Izuku could tell he was still mulling it over, trying to figure out what kind of relationship was going on between them. Izuku was extra cautious around him when it came to anything having to do with All Might, and he had a feeling that he had just prompted another investigation. He supposed that was only fair after what he had done. So, the evidence, what did you want me to do? Todoroki looked at him again, but the expression he wore made Izuku feel like he was thinking about him more than he was thinking about the question. It wasn't until he looked away that he saw any sort of sign that Todoroki had actually heard him. It took a moment to think about it before he spoke. Nothing. Izuku had expected that answer, but it would be a lie to say he wasn't disappointed. For now, at least. I have to think about it, he added before Izuku could prod him. That was fair. It was a lot to drop onto someone. He didn't know what else to say, so he didn't say anything. He just turned back to his lunch, which he had barely touched, and kept poking at it until it was time for them to go back inside. Todoroki didn't seem mad at him, at least not anymore, but he still felt sick to his stomach just knowing that he knew what he did. He knew the silence that hung between them was no different than it used to be, but it felt heavier now, heavy with the lack of anger he knew that he deserved. He pushed away any feelings he had on the matter as quickly as he could. Done with one awful conversation and on to the next. One step at a time was all he could do. He had to talk to Shinso. End of chapter.